Welcome to the X Project podcast. This is a podcast of the X Project Substack, which can be found at thexproject.substack.com. We're all Soviets now. Neil Ferguson's sobering, provocative, and controversial article. Article number 67, published June 26, 2024. I am breaking the normal protocol with this article because Neil Ferguson's article so moved me that I am sharing it in its entirety here for this edition of the X Project. Neil Ferguson, We're All Soviets Now. A government with a permanent deficit and a bloated military. A bogus ideology pushed by elites. Poor health among ordinary people. Senescent leaders. Sound familiar? By Neil Ferguson, June 18th, 2024. Barry Weiss here. In the early days of the Free Press, I put together a fantasy roster. Neil Ferguson was at the top of it. Today, I am thrilled to announce that Neil is joining the Free Press as a bi-weekly columnist. Neil's resume is a little much. He has 2 degrees from Oxford and has taught there as well as at Cambridge, NYU, the London School of Economics, and Harvard. He's now a senior fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution. Given the present state of many of those institutions, you might dismiss Neil as an establishment hack who shapes history to serve the acceptable narrative. That isn't Neil. Unlike so many of the excellent sheep that enjoy tenure in academe, Neil thinks for himself, a quality you can see on display in any one of his 16 books and counting, including The Pity of War, Explaining World War I, Kissinger, 1923 to 1968, The Idealist, Part 1 of a 2-part biography, The Square and the Tower, and most recently, Doom, The Politics of Catastrophe. For this incredible body of work, King Charles just knighted Neil a few days ago. In recent years, Neil has been one of the most thoughtful and intellectually honest voices in the cultural battle that has engulfed America's most storied institutions, including academia. In an epochal essay he published this past December in the Free Press, The Treason of the Intellectuals, he argued that, quote, American academia has gone in the opposite political direction, leftward instead of rightward, but has ended up in much the same place, end quote, as German academia pre-World War II. Quote, the question is whether we, unlike the Germans, can do something about it, end quote. Neil is doing something. He is one of the founders of the new University of Austin, where I sit on the board alongside him and where this fall we will welcome the university's first class. Oh, and did I mention that he is married to Ayaan Hirsi Ali? In journalism, we call that burying the lead. Sir Neil's first column is just below. Barry Weiss. The witty phrase, quote, late Soviet America, end quote, was coined by the Princeton historian Harold James back in 2020. It has only become more apposite since then, as the Cold War we're in, the second one, heats up. I first pointed out that we're in a Cold War II back in 2018. In the articles for the New York Times and National Review, I tried to show how the People's Republic of China now occupies a space vacated by the Soviet Union when it collapsed in 1991. This view is less controversial now than it was then. China is clearly not only an ideological rival, firmly committed to Marxism, Leninism, and one-party rule. It's also a technological competitor, the only one the US confronts in fields such as artificial intelligence and quantum computing. It's a military rival, with a navy that is already larger than ours and a nuclear arsenal that is catching up fast. And it's a geopolitical rival, asserting itself not only in the Indo-Pacific, but also through proxies in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. But it only recently struck me that in this new Cold War, we, and not the Chinese, might be the Soviets. It's a bit like that moment when the British comedians David Mitchell and Robert Webb, playing Waffen-SS officers toward the end of World War II, asked the immortal question, quote, "Are we the baddies?" End quote. I imagine two American sailors asking themselves one day, perhaps as their aircraft carrier is sinking beneath their feet somewhere near the Taiwan Strait, "Are we the Soviets?" Yes, I know what you are going to say. There is a world of difference between the dysfunctional planned economy that Stalin built and bequeathed his heirs, which collapsed as soon as Mikhail Gorbachev tried to reform it, and the dynamic market economy that we Americans take pride in. The Soviet system squandered resources and all but guaranteed shortages of consumer goods. The Soviet healthcare system was crippled by dilapidated hospitals and chronic shortages of equipment. There was grinding poverty, hunger, and child labor. In America today, such conditions exist only in the bottom quintile of the economic distribution, though the extent to which they do exist is truly appalling. Infant mortality in the late Soviet Union was around 25 per thousand. The figure for the US in 2021 was 5.4. But for single mothers in the Mississippi Delta or Appalachia, it is 13 per 1,000. The comparison to the Soviet Union, you might argue, is nevertheless risible. Take a closer look. A chronic soft budget constraint in the public sector, which was a key weakness of the Soviet system. I see a version of that in the US deficits forecast by the Congressional Budget Office to exceed 5% of GDP for the foreseeable future and to rise inexorably to 8.5% by 2054. The insertion of the central government into investment decision-making process? I see that too, despite the hype around the Biden administration's industrial policy. Economists keep promising us a productivity miracle from the information technology, most recently AI. But the annual average growth rate of productivity in the US non-farm business sector has been stuck at just 1.5% since 2007, only marginally better than the dismal years 1973 to 1980. The US economy might be the envy of the rest of the world today, but recall how American experts overrated the Soviet economy in the 1970s and 1980s. And yet, you insist, the Soviet Union was a sick man more than it was a superpower, whereas the United States has no equal in the realm of military technology and firepower? Actually, no. We have a military that is simultaneously expensive and unequal to the tasks it confronts, as Senator Roger Wicker's newly published report makes clear. As I read Wicker's report, and I recommend you do the same, I kept thinking of what successive Soviet leaders said until the bitter end, that the Red Army was the biggest and therefore most lethal military in the world. On paper it was. But paper was what the Soviet bear turned out to be made of. It could not even win a war in Afghanistan, despite 10 years of death and destruction. Now, why does that sound familiar? On paper, the US defense budget does indeed exceed those of all the other members of NATO put together. But what does that defense budget actually buy us? As Wicker argues, not nearly enough to contend with the coalition against democracy that China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea have been aggressively building. In Wicker's words, quote, America's military has a lack of modern equipment, a paucity of training and maintenance funding, and a massive infrastructure backlog. It is stretched too thin and outfitted too poorly to meet all the missions assigned to it at a reasonable level of risk. Our adversaries recognize this, and it makes them more adventurous and aggressive. End quote. And, as I have pointed out elsewhere, the federal government will almost certainly spend more on debt service than on defense this year. It gets worse. According to the CBO, the share of gross domestic product going on interest payments on the federal debt will be double what we spend on national security by 2041, thanks partly to the fact that the rising cost of the debt will squeeze defense spending down from 3% of GDP this year to a projected 2.3% in 30 years' time. This decline makes no sense at a time when the threats posed by the new Chinese-led Axis are manifestly growing. Even more striking to me are the political, social, and cultural resemblances I detect between the US and the USSR. Gerontocratic leadership was one of the hallmarks of late Soviet leadership, personified by the senility of Leonid Brezhnev, Yuri Andropov, and Konstantin Chernenko. But by current American standards, the later Soviet leaders were not old men. Brezhnev was 75 when he died in 1982, but he had suffered his first major stroke 7 years before. Andropov was only 68 when he succeeded Brezhnev, but he suffered total kidney failure just a few months after taking over. Chernenko was 72 when he came to power. He was already a hopeless invalid, suffering from emphysema, heart failure, bronchitis, pleurisy, and pneumonia. It is a reflection of the quality of healthcare enjoyed by their American counterparts today that they are both older and healthier. Nevertheless, Joe Biden, 81, and Donald Trump, 78, are hardly men in the first flush of youth and vitality, as the Wall Street Journal recently made cringe-inducingly clear. The former cannot distinguish between two Hispanic cabinet secretaries, Alejandro Mayorkas and Xavier Becerra. The latter muddles up Nikki Haley and Nancy Pelosi. If Kamala Harris has never watched The Death of Stalin, it's not too late. Another notable feature of late Soviet life was total public cynicism about nearly all institution. Leon Aaron's brilliant book, Roads to the Temple, shows just how wretched life in the 1980s had become. In the great return to truth, unleashed by Gorbachev's policy of glasnost, Soviet citizens were able to pour forth their discontents in letters to a suddenly free press. Some of what they wrote about was specific to the Soviet context. In particular, the revelations about the realities of Soviet history, especially the crimes of the Stalin era. But to reread Russians' complaints about their lives in the 1980s is to come across more than a few eerie foreshadowings of the American present. In a letter to Komsomolskaya Pravda from 1990, for example, a reader decried the, quote, ghastly and tragic loss of morality by a huge number of people living within the borders of the USSR, end quote. Symptoms of moral debility included apathy and hypocrisy, cynicism, servility, and snitching. The entire country, he wrote, was suffocating in a, quote, miasma of barefaced and ceaseless public lies and demagoguery, end quote. By July 1988, 44% of the people polled by Moskovy Novosti felt that theirs was an unjust society. Look at the most recent Gallup surveys of American opinion, and one finds a similar disillusionment. The share of the public that has confidence in the Supreme Court, the banks, public schools, the presidency, large technology companies, and organized labor is somewhere between 25 and 27%. For newspapers, the criminal justice system, television news, big business, and Congress, it's below 20%. For Congress, it's 8%. Average confidence in major institutions is roughly half what it was in 1979. It is now well known that younger Americans are suffering an epidemic of mental ill health, blamed by John Haidt and others on smartphones and social media, while older Americans are succumbing to, quote, deaths of despair, end quote, a phrase made famous by Anne Case and Angus Deaton. And while Case and Deaton focused on the surge in deaths of despair among white middle-aged Americans, their work became the social science complement to J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy. More recent research shows that African Americans have caught up with their white contemporaries when it comes to overdose deaths. In 2022 alone, more Americans died of fentanyl overdoses than were killed in 3 major wars: Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. The recent data on American mortality are shocking. Life expectancy has declined in the past decade in a way we do not see in comparable developed countries. The main explanations, according to the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, are a striking increase in deaths due to drug overdoses, alcohol abuse, and suicide, and a rise in various diseases associated with obesity. To be precise, between 1990 and 2017, drugs and alcohol were responsible for more than 1.3 million deaths among the working age population aged 25 to 64. Suicide accounted for 569,099 deaths, again of working age Americans, over the same period. Metabolic and cardiac causes of death, such as hypertension, type 2 diabetes, and coronary heart disease, also surged in tandem with obesity. This reversal of life expectancy simply isn't happening in other developed countries. Peter Sterling and Michael L. Platt argue in a recent paper that this is because West European countries, along with the United Kingdom and Australia, do more to, quote, provide communal assistance at every stage of life, thus facilitating diverse paths forward and protecting individuals and families from despair, end quote. In the United States, by contrast, quote, every symptom of despair has been defined as a disorder or dysregulation within the individual. This incorrectly frames the problem, forcing individuals to grapple on their own, end quote, they write. Quote, it also emphasizes treatment by pharmacology, providing innumerable drugs for anxiety, depression, anger, psychosis, and obesity, plus new drugs to treat addictions to the old drugs, end quote. Obese? Try Ozempic. The mass self-destruction of Americans captured in the phrase "deaths of despair" for years has been ringing a faint bell in my head. This week, I remembered where I had seen it before: in late Soviet and post-Soviet Russia. While male life expectancy improved in all Western countries in the late 20th century, in the Soviet Union it began to decline after 1965, rallied briefly in the mid-1980s, and then fell off a cliff in the early 1990s, slumping again after the 1998 financial crisis. The death rate among Russian men aged 35 to 44, for example, more than doubled between 1989 and 1994. The explanation is as clear as Stolichnaya. In July 1994, two Russian scholars, Alexander Nemtsov and Vladimir Shkolnikov, published an article in the national daily newspaper Izvestia with the memorable title, quote, "To live or to drink?" End quote. Nemtsov and Shkolnikov demonstrated, in the words of a recent review article, quote, an almost perfect negative linear relationship between these two indicators, end quote. All they were missing was a sequel, to live or to smoke, as lung cancer was the other big reason Soviet men died young. A culture of binge drinking and chain smoking was facilitated by the dirt-cheap price of cigarettes under the Soviet regime and the dirt-cheap prices of alcohol after the collapse of communism. The statistics are as shocking as the scenes I remember witnessing in Moscow and St. Petersburg in the late 1980s and early 1990s, which made even my native Glasgow seem abstemious. An analysis of 25,000 autopsies conducted in Siberia in 1990 to 2004 showed that 21% of adult male deaths due to cardiovascular disease involved lethal or near-lethal levels of ethanol in the blood. Smoking accounted for a staggering 26% of all male deaths in Russia in 2001. Suicides among men aged 50 to 54 reached 140 per 100,000 population in 1994, compared to 39.2 per 100,000 for non-Hispanic American men aged 45 to 54 in 2015. In other words, Case and Denton's Deaths of Despair are a kind of pale imitation of the Russian version 20 to 40 years ago. The self-destruction of Homo Sovieticus was worse. And yet, is not the resemblance to the self-destruction of Homo Americanus the really striking thing? Of course, the two healthcare systems look superficially quite different. The Soviet system was just under-resourced. At the heart of the American healthcare disaster, by contrast, is a huge mismatch between expenditure, which is internationally unrivaled relative to GDP, and outcomes, which are terrible. But, like the Soviet system as a whole, the US healthcare system has evolved so that a whole bunch of vested interests can extract rents. The bloated, dysfunctional bureaucracy, brilliantly parodied by South Park in a recent episode, is great for the nomenklatura, lousy for the proles. Meanwhile, as in the late Soviet Union, the hillbillies, actually the working class and a goodly slice of the middle class too, drink and drug themselves to death even as the political and cultural elite double down on a bizarre ideology that no one really believes in. In the Soviet Union, the great lies were that the party and the state existed to serve the interests of the workers and peasants, and that the United States and its allies were imperialist, little better than the Nazis had been in the Great Patriotic War. The truth was that the nomenklatura, i.e. the elite members, of the party had rapidly formed a new class with its own, often hereditary privileges, consigning the workers and peasants to poverty and servitude, while Stalin, who had started World War II on the same side as Hitler, utterly failed to foresee the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union and then became the most brutal imperialist in his own right. The equivalent falsehoods in late Soviet America are that the institutions controlled by the Democratic Party, the federal bureaucracy, the universities, the major foundations, and most of the big corporations are devoted to advancing hitherto marginalized racial and sexual minorities, and that the principal goals of US foreign policy are to combat climate change and, as Jake Sullivan puts it, to help other countries defend themselves without sending US troops to war. In reality, policies to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion do nothing to help poor minorities. Instead, the sole beneficiaries appear to be a horde of apparatchik DEI officers. In the meantime, these initiatives are clearly undermining educational standards, even at elite medical schools, and encouraging the mutilation of thousands of teenagers in the name of gender-affirming surgery. As for the current direction of US foreign policy, it is not so much to help other countries defend themselves as to egg on others to fight our adversaries as proxies without supplying them with sufficient weaponry to stand much chance of winning. This strategy, most visible in Ukraine, makes some sense for the United States, which discovered in the global war on terror that its much vaunted military could not defeat even the ragtag Taliban after 20 years of effort. But believing American blandishments may ultimately doom Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan to follow South Vietnam and Afghanistan into oblivion. As for climate change, the world is now awash in Chinese electric vehicles, batteries, and solar cells, all mass-produced with the help of state subsidies and coal-burning power stations. At least we tried to resist the Soviet strategy of unleashing Marxism, protectionism on the Third World, the human cost of which was almost incalculable. Our policy elites' preoccupation with climate change has resulted in utter strategic incoherence by comparison. The fact is that China has been responsible for 3/4 of the 34% increase in carbon dioxide emissions since Greta Thunberg's birth in 2003, and 2/3 of the 48% increase in coal consumption. To see the extent of the gulf that now separates the American nomenclatura from the workers and peasants, consider the findings of a Rasmussen poll from last September, which sought to distinguish the attitudes of the Ivy Leaguers from ordinary Americans. The poll defined the former as, quote, those having a postgraduate degree, a household income of more than $150,000 annually, living in a zip code with more than 10,000 people per square mile, end quote, and having attended, quote, Ivy League schools or other elite private schools, including Northwestern, Duke, Stanford, and the University of Chicago, end quote. Asked if they would favor, quote, rationing of gas, meat, and electricity, end quote, to fight climate change, 89% of Ivy Leaguers said yes, as against 28% of regular people. Asked if they would personally pay $500 more in taxes and higher costs to fight climate change, 75% of the Ivy Leaguers said yes, versus 25% of everyone else. Quote, teachers should decide what students are taught as opposed to parents, end quote, was a statement with which 71% of the Ivy Leaguers agreed, nearly double the share of the average citizens. Quote, does the US provide too much individual freedom? End quote. More than half of Ivy Leaguers said yes. Just 15% of ordinary mortals did. The elite were roughly twice as fond as everyone else of members of Congress, journalists, union leaders, and lawyers. Perhaps unsurprisingly, 88% of the Ivy Leaguers said their personal finances were improving, as opposed to 1 in 5 of the general population. A bogus ideology that hardly anyone really believes in, but everyone has to parrot unless they want to be labeled dissidents. Deplorables. Check. A population that no longer regards patriotism, religion, having children, or community involvement as important? Check. How about a massive disaster that lays bare the utter incompetence and mendacity that pervades every level of government? For Chernobyl, read COVID. And while I make no claims to legal expertise, I think I recognize Soviet justice when I see, in a New York courtroom, the legal system being abused in the hope not just of imprisoning, but also of discrediting the leader of the political opposition. The question that haunts me is, what if China has learned the lessons of Cold War I better than we have? I fear that Xi Jinping has not only understood that, at all costs, he must avoid the fate of his Soviet counterparts. He has also, more profoundly, understood that we can be maneuvered into being the Soviets ourselves. And what better way to achieve that than to quarantine an island not far from his coastline and then defy us to send a naval expedition to run the blockade, with the obvious risk of starting World War III. The worst thing about the approaching Taiwan semiconductor crisis is that, compared with the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, the roles will be reversed. Biden or Trump gets to be Khrushchev. XJP gets to be JFK. Just watch him prepping the narrative, telling European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen that Washington is trying to goad Beijing into attacking Taiwan. We can tell ourselves that our many contemporary pathologies are the results of outside forces waging a multi-decade campaign of subversion. They have undoubtedly tried, just as the CIA tried its best to subvert Soviet rule in the Cold War. Yet, we also need to contemplate the possibility that we have done this to ourselves, just as the Soviets did many of the same things to themselves. It was a common liberal worry during the Cold War that we might end up becoming as ruthless, secretive, and unaccountable as the Soviets because of the exigencies of the nuclear arms race. Little did anyone suspect that we would end up becoming as degenerate as the Soviets and tacitly give up on winning the Cold War now underway. I still cling to the hope that we can avoid losing Cold War II, that the economic, demographic, and social pathologies that afflict all one-party communist regimes will ultimately doom Xi's China dream. But the higher the toll rises of deaths of despair and the wider the gap grows between America's nomenclatura and everyone else, the less confident I feel that our own homegrown pathologies will be slower acting. Are we the Soviets? Look around you. Neil Ferguson's latest book is Doom. Follow him on X at nfergus. That's at NFERGUS. Thank you. This concludes the X Project's podcast number 67.